So let me introduce our speaker for today's session. So his name is Mr. Ravi Sarangapani. So Mr. Ravi is associated in the field of medical devices for around 25 years and handled a senior roles in a variety of functions and has been responsible for strategy, branding, marketing, product positioning, sales and distribution, international marketing, product development, regulatory affairs, and quality assurance for the medical devices. So his experience and backgrounds enables him to mentor, advise, and guide startups in the range of business areas, including financial business strategy and business planning, identifying and advising on key success, competitive analysis, marketing strategy and planning, design and development, and also mentoring top management to enable high effectiveness of the startup, and also many more field in the in relation to medical devices. So let's welcome Mr. Ravi. Now I hand over my presentation of the overall session to Mr. Ravi. So now Mr. Ravi can take over the session, and I think we can start now.
I thank Vikrant and the organizers at Tides IIT for the wonderful work that we are doing in supporting the startup space in medical devices, and also for organizing webinars like this, which help in disseminating knowledge and understanding of the field to medical device startups, which is so very important. So welcome all of you once again. I am going to speak about the crucial role of design control in medical devices. And my presentation is going to be about 35, 40, 45 minutes or so, not more than that. And then we'll have about 15, 20 minutes to take questions and have some interaction. So the medical device industry and medical device companies fundamentally have to work through three very strongly interconnected areas of organization. You have the business side, which is technology, business, finance, forecasting, planning. You have regulation, which is very, very crucial and important in medical devices. And of course, you have technology, which spans the gamut from research and development to performance testing to actually having a device on the market. And these three business areas are very closely interlinked. And out of these three business areas, it is the technology side which contributes significantly to device risk. Now, the understanding of risk in the medical field is very different from the understanding of risk in a non-medical field or in the consumer field or in the automotive field and so on. So risk is not a risk, and the consequences of risk, which could be a failure to a device or a malfunction of a device, could not be something as simple as, exchanging or replacing, because the implication of risk in a medical device or in medical equipment could be far-reaching, could be very severe consequences, and could threaten life and limb. So you have device risks which come from the technology side, which could cause risks to the life and well-being of patients, influence patient safety, safety of users, safety of those who handle the equipment, not just the patient. So risk has to be seen more holistically. Sometimes it can even cause a threat to the business. If the problem is big enough, it would definitely have regulatory implications in terms of actions that regulators may need to take, and not to mention the risk to reputation and liability. And so this brings us to how design controls influence risk. So the US FDA, where you have good quality information available, which is shared in the public domain, found that about 44%, not a small number, of quality problems that led to voluntary recall actions by healthcare companies, medical companies, during a 6-year period were attributed to errors or deficiencies that were designed into particular devices and may have been prevented by adequate design controls. And 55% of all warning letters in 2010, for example, were related to design controls. So what is this? This brings us to design controls. Now, those of you who are students, startups, founders, who are interested in this area, many of you would have heard of this standard, the ISO 13485. And ISO 13485 is the Bible for the medical device and the medical technology industry. This is the standard put out by the International Standards Organization. The latest and current version is 2016, which defines what a quality management system needs to be for medical devices and what are the requirements to be fulfilled to enable regulatory approval. And the 2 or 3 clauses that we will specifically look at today of this standard, which pertain to what is called the realization of product or the process of product realization, and 7.3, which pertains to design controls. So planning of product realization, what does ISO 13485, the standard, define the requirements in terms of what a medical device organization shall fulfill? So the organization is expected to establish quality objectives and requirements, establish the need to have the right processes and documents, provide resources, define verification, validation, monitoring, measurement methods, and so on, traceability, very crucial, and most importantly, define the records or the documents that are needed to provide evidence that everything that is planned is being done. Which brings us to where does design and development control fit within this 7.1? And that brings us to 7.3 of ISO 13485. Very clear statement. The organization shall document procedures for design and development. So this is a factor that is going to keep repeating, irrespective of every seminar you attend, every consultant you speak to, any regulator you speak to, you will keep hearing about the importance of documentation, because the standard golden rule in medical devices or in the healthcare field is, if it was written down, it was done. And if there is no record, then the presumption is it didn't happen. So recording and documentation to create evidence is like a holy grail in this field. So what does 7.3.2 design development planning expect an organization in medical device field to do? So very clear statement again, the organization shall plan and control the design and development of products. So there is no option here. The organization is expected to plan and control this process. So what exactly is this process that we are looking at? Very simple, easy way to represent the design development process is design inputs leading to design outputs leading to a finished device. So let's just take a little bit of a diversion, look at what kind of processes we are looking at, and then we will move on to what a design control procedure actually needs to be. So design inputs. But what are design inputs? So every requirement that a device eventually needs to fulfill, expressed in clear, quantified engineering terms, is a design input. So it could be a functional requirement, it could be safety requirements coming out of a standard, it could be a reliability requirement in terms of life, it could be a usability requirement in terms of handling, it could be a performance requirement which may be connected to a test standard, it could be an applicable mandatory standard by some organization, it could be a regulatory requirement, it could be a risk management output. Okay, so what is a risk management output? So we'll speak about risk analysis as we go along, but risk analysis is like the twin brother of design control, and the process of risk analysis is the process by which you as a startup or as an ideator would take the help of multiple stakeholders to define what, in simple terms, what all could go wrong with this device throughout its life cycle, from the day I start design work till the day it is used in a patient or in any other setting, till the day it is eventually disposed of. What are all the possible things that could go wrong? So that is the process of defining risk. And the output of risk management could be certain risks which have to be covered in the design process, and that therefore a risk management output becomes a design input. So performance history of similar designs, manufacturing requirements, quality requirements, all of this would be design inputs. But what is the sort of most important design input is a user need. What exactly is an actual user of the device? What does he have to say in terms of what the device needs to fulfill in terms of its functioning? So that is a very big and crucial design input. What about design outputs? So the obvious ones, specifications, drawings, quality plans, all of these are design outputs, but some outputs which sometimes we always think of outputs in engineering terms or in specification terms, but an instruction for use or a product label is also a design output. Catalogs or marketing literature that is produced, which may make claims as to what the product is supposed or the device is supposed to fulfill or the equipment is supposed to do, is also a design output. And a service manual to service equipment is also a design output. So the other two elements of the design process, very crucial. One is design verification, which basically verifies whether design outputs in accordance with design inputs. And the other is design validation, that whether the device meets the requirements of the user. The other way in which this process is sometimes represented is a kind of a waterfall model, and this is pretty easy to sort of get. You start with user needs, it flows into design inputs, and then goes through the design process, resulting in the creation of design outputs, which eventually leads to a medical device. And the review, as you see, reviews happen throughout the process, whether the input and the user needs are matched, whether the process is in accordance with the inputs, whether the output is in accordance with the input, and so on. But again, if you see, design verification is output versus input. And a very good way of understanding the difference between verification and validation is verification checks, did I make the device right? That, which means, is my design output in accordance with my design input? So there's no mistake anywhere. Okay. Whereas validation is a little different. Validation checks whether the final finished medical device, the eventual product, whether it meets the needs of the user, right? This is not about whether there was a small engineering error in the calculation, whether there was a drawing mistake. This is about whether the device in its entirety fulfills what the user's requirement was, and which means, did I make the right device? Okay, so it's just the transposition of one small word, but a whole big difference in meaning. So this takes us to the next aspect of clause 7.3. What is the expectation? So the organization is needed to document the design and development stages. Now we are talking about the design procedure itself. So design procedure that is defined by an organization needs to define the design development stages that will be followed. You need to define how you will review at each stage. And we'll speak about these two first before we move on to the next four. So a typical stage gate approach that is followed by the medical device industry globally would when we say stage gate approach, so there are stages. So we are talking about the stages, and these stages are referring to the same stages that the standard is talking about. And the gates, I'll come to the gates. So the stages of the process would very typically be a define stage, a develop stage, a validate stage, a limited release stage, and a full release stage. So you can sort of break the entire process of creating a device from ideation through proof of concept to eventual commercialization. From a design perspective, is defined typically in these 5 stages. A defined stage, so you'll find that this is a little more granular and a little more detailed than the typical ideation, proof of concept, prototype, launch, which is what is favored, but that is not detailed enough to fulfill the requirements of a rigorous design control process. Rigorous design control process would have stages defined in this manner. And what typically would happen in each of these stages? Many things, okay? And most of this is common sense. So if you look at the defined stage, it would speak about defining what exactly the requirements of the device, the product, the equipment, whatever is being created, what are the requirements it needs to fulfill. So fundamentally, the user needs and design inputs, right? What would actually happen during the develop stage is the real design or the creative aspect of the project, which is taking these user needs and design inputs and actually performing all those design activities to result in the creation of design outputs. And you see a lot of text here, most of which is not going to be readable on your screen, so I'm not going into the detail right now. The validate stage is fundamentally the stage post-development, where everything to do with safety and performance is assessed. And a lot of this is going to be detailed technical assessment. So this is one aspect, safety and performance assessment. So this is what is typically known in the industry as verification validation, or DVER and DVAL, which is design verification, design validation. But this is only one half of the story. The other half of the story is the manufacturing validations, which is the definition of how the device or the equipment is going to be manufactured, is going to be put together, is going to be assembled, and how all of this would eventually come together, create a mass manufacturing system which would deliver consistent, reliable, and predictable outputs. So all of this process, completion of all of these processes and completion of all of these methods would happen in the validation stage, post which is a typical definition of a limited release or a controlled release to a small subset of users, which could be in the form of a clinical trial, it could be in the form of a clinical study, or if it's a device which does not require a clinical trial because it's not new or novel, it could still be a limited commercial release just to make sure everything is functioning fine before moving into a full release. And the blue bits that you see at the bottom of the screen, so what you saw on the top, define, develop, validate, limited release, full release, are the stages. And the blue bits you see at the bottom are the gates. And that's why it's called the stage gate system. So you do not pass from one stage to the other stage without passing through the gate. So a design review one would be the gate through which one has to pass to go from the defined stage to the developed stage. And what would it take to clear this gate is what the design control procedure needs to define, right? So you have design review one, which is defined to develop. And once all development activities are complete and all design outputs are ready, design review two to move from the develop stage to the validate stage. And then once all validation work, all safety testing, everything is completed, design review three to be able to have the first clinical use for the device or the product. And then design review four, once the limited use results are fine, and moving on to a full commercial launch. And the process typically would also define a design review five, which is 6 to 9 months after commercial launch, with market feedback at the end of that period, making sure that full market release has not thrown up unexpected surprises and the device everywhere is functioning as per expectation. There's also a link that the design process has to the business process. Now, this is typical for larger organizations, not so relevant for small startups at this point, but a design review gate could also be connected to a business gate. And a business gate would be business leaders in the organization making decisions on whether to progress further with the design, whether the market estimations are being validated, that yes, there is an appropriate market for the device, yes, we have the funding required, yes, the team is intact and the team is able to deliver to expectations. So how would the business make these decisions on whether we continue with development on a project or not? These decisions would typically be made connected to the design gates. So once a design team achieves design review one, they would go back to the business leadership to ask for more money. So money would be sanctioned for a particular stage. And that's typically how a business, the design process gets integrated into the business outlook of the organization. The other aspect that is important, these two worms that you see on the screen, the text is small. So the blue worm is the marketing worm and the red worm is the engineering worm. And the green blocks that you see are the gates. So design review 1, design review 2, 3, LMR, limited release, and full commercial release. And what you see here, and what you see in the bottom, that is text, which I think is legible on your screen, the stages, the define stage, develop stage, validate stage, and the LMR FCL stages. And you see how functional responsibilities vary. So the entire initial phase from the define stage to the develop stage is all very, very heavy from an engineering perspective, okay? And the actual technology aspect is very important. But as validation comes to an end, and as through the validation process, you find that the red worm starts coming down and the blue worm starts going up. And that's where the marketing aspect or the customer interface or the user interface aspect and the broader market interface aspect starts becoming more and more important. Now, this is very important for small startups to understand, because when you're typically, if you are two founders or if you're three founders, you must keep in mind that it is not adequate or it's not enough to be completely technology focused. You need to have a technology focus. You also need to have a market focus. You also need to have a user focus, because you need to do all the things right. And sometimes when there are two founders, it's very useful for one of the founders to be sort of the tech focused founder and the other founder to be customer on the market interface focused guy. So this is very important, because these functional responsibilities, they vary throughout the cycle of creation of a new product. And from inception going towards launch, the functional requirement is not the same. Coming back to our clause 7.3, the organization shall document. Yeah, that word again. So document. Procedures have to be documented. So what is the requirement of a design control system which is written up in the form of a procedure? So a procedure typically needs to define what is the scope, responsibilities, who is going to do what, definitions, okay, the stage gate process or any other process that one may choose to define that this is going to be our design process. How will we take decisions? How will we progress? What are our phases? What will happen in each of these phases? How will we document these happenings, and how will we create the evidence? how would we ensure traceability of design output to design input? Okay, so what is the method that we are going to follow to make sure that our outputs were in accordance with what the requirements of the device were as specified by users or as we specified in the beginning? So what is the process we followed? How did we document? And how can this be verified by an independent third party? The independent third party could be a regulator, the independent third party could be an auditing agency. So anybody who is going to come and audit is going to need to verify all these records and all this evidence. So the procedure needs to define how this work will be done. Procedure needs to define how will we review, what is the method we are going to follow internally to make sure that we are, I wouldn't say not making mistakes, but is my process robust enough to capture mistakes, to catch mistakes before they become big? So what is the process I'm going to follow? What is my review process? What is going to be what are going to be the methods by which we will do design verification? How will we document these methods? How will we write protocols? How will we establish acceptance criteria? How will we establish a test protocol? Okay, all of this needs to be defined in the procedure. And lastly, but most importantly, what is the process internally our organization will follow to release product for commercial use? So what are all the criteria that will have to be met? What are all the documents that will have to be completed? What should be the state of readiness of the device? And who are all the people who will sign off to say that, yes, we are completely satisfied that the work that has been done in the design, manufacturing, inspection, test, packaging, labeling of this device is safety and effectiveness has been ascertained beyond all possible reasonable doubt. And these are the people who are going to sign this off. And this is how we are internally going to assure that the product is safe and effective for human use. So what is the process? All this has to be defined in the design procedure. So typically, since we spoke about define, develop, validate, limited release, so the procedure needs to define what will happen in each of these phases in a fair amount of detail. Not so rigid that it constrains you to only working in a particular manner, but definitely specific enough to define inputs and outcomes. So, for example, in the definition phase, how will we initiate a new development? Who are the people who will be responsible? How will we collect? What is the process by which we will define design inputs? At what stage will we connect with users? How will we connect with users? How do we define a user? Would a user only be a clinical user? Would it also be a distributor, for example? Would it also be a hospital nurse? Would we talk to a hospital administrator? Who are all the stakeholders? Would we have focus groups? Would we speak to only individuals? Would we do interviews? So what are all the methods that would be followed in creating the design inputs? What are the standards we would refer to? Will we do competitor benchmarking? If we do competitor benchmarking, how will we define competitor attributes? Would we access complaint data from anywhere, from external databases, for example? Would we look at standards? How would we do risk management? Who are the people who will be involved? Would we only use internal resources? Would we use external third parties to do risk management? How would we identify risk mitigation? So would we have safety by design methods? Would we have protective measures? And how would we define design outputs? How will we document? Okay, so all of this is the extent of detail. I'm only going to speak about the definition phase. We will rush through the others because this is fundamentally just to give you an idea. At the end of the day, every organization and every group, you need to write your own design procedure in keeping with your own needs. So we're only looking at broad principles here. So this is the extent of detail that is expected from a design procedure. It's expected to define for you how you will function. That's an example of how you would define responsibilities and authorities, the activities or the tasks on the left. So, and which are all the functions. Again, in a small startup, that's going to be probably Mr. A and Mr. B doing everything. So not very, very relevant for a small organization. So I'm going to just spend a little bit of time on the important subject of design inputs. Okay. And beyond that, we will skip a couple of slides and move on. So the important thing about design inputs, it is said that writing design inputs is something of an art. And I'm pretty sure this is unfortunately a bit of a hope that most startup ideas and most I would say startups who come up with something novel, who have an idea, don't really look at or bother to document in a manner in which it is eventually required to assure design control and design safety eventually. So one of the important aspects of documentation is writing design inputs. And the benefit of writing comprehensive design inputs is the risk of missing design requirements during the design process is minimized. Okay, it saves you from your oops moment. Oh my God, we missed this. So that's how a design control system helps in making design more robust. If you take the time at the beginning to define what all the design needs to fulfill and write it down in the form of design inputs, the risk of missing something is minimized substantially. And while writing design inputs, it's very important to follow certain crucial guidelines. A design input should be written in such a way that a particular statement contains only one input. So you should not be mixing inputs, or you should not be mixing requirements for two different parameters into a single statement. So that's what it means when it says unambiguous. There should be only one possible interpretation. There should be only one particular need that is defined in one input. The statement should be complete by itself. So if you write a design input as a person who is let's say the ideator, and then you pass on this written document to your engineer, he should be able to work with this statement, understand it, and create a design input. So that is what it means when it says it has to be complete. It has to be consistent. So you can't write a design input which either at the beginning of the sentence says something which is at variance with the end of the sentence, or design input number 3 clashes with design input number 17. Okay, so that's very important that inputs have to be consistent. And lastly, and most importantly, it should be verifiable. So the input should be written in such a manner that it is possible to verify that the output met the input. So this is basically about quantification. Inputs should be in quantifiable engineering terms as far as possible, because that is what will allow a reasonable way to verify or to carry out design verification. So it's not enough for design inputs to only speak about the core of the device or the clinical aspect or the function. Okay, accessories to the device, interfaces, packaging, the clinical conditions that a device has to meet while in service, the environmental conditions expected in storage, handling, transit, distribution, all need to be covered in design inputs. So remember, you have to think product life cycle from the day it starts to the day it is disposed. And also, since we are in the critical healthcare and device and tech field, aspects like cleanability, biocompatibility, usability, how will the device be sterilized, whether an implanted device would be subjected to an MRI scan, the patient would be subjected to an MRI scan, so what would be the effect, and any other clinical conditions. All of this would form part and parcel of a design input. Few examples about writing good design inputs, and these are 3 statements I have here, all speaking about the same thing, and just to illustrate the example of how a design input can be written better. So a control panel should have good visibility is a nice statement, doesn't allow verification, should be easily readable from a distance of 10 feet by a person with normal eyesight. Yes, so this is easily verifiable. Take a person with normal eyesight, station him at 10 feet and ask him, can you read it? Okay, so you can verify. Should have font size of so and so. So this is even more precise. Now the important difference between the second line and the third line is the second line gives scope to the designer to achieve this by any means possible. And the third statement constrains the designer do exactly this, which means the designer is a postman, right? So the second or the middle statement should be easily readable from a distance of X by a person with normal eyesight is the most balanced and well-written design input, not the one which actually specifies and constrains the designer to do exactly this. Similar example, so a unit which is being designed to carry something should be portable. Okay, should be portable, fine, but not very easy to verify. For example, a well-built individual may be able to easily carry the device, but a female nurse who doesn't have the same capacity to lift weight will not be able to easily handle the device. So again, it's vague. Should not weigh more than so many kilos. Yeah, that's a lot better. And should not weigh more than so many kilos and must have handles to enable easy lifting and transport. Or should not weigh more than so many kilos, and should have the means of handling and carrying. Okay, so again, you will see that the fourth example here, the fourth statement, actually is the nicest way of describing. You are defining a weight because that's an absolute requirement. You are also saying that it needs to have ease of handling and carrying, which is easily verifiable. So there's one more example, but I will skip this in the interest of time. Now, coming back to the aspect of documentation, and remember, we are in the first stage of the design procedure, which is the define stage. And in the define stage, typically, there would be a design development plan, there would be a design history file, there would be a trace matrix, which I'm going to come to in a little bit. There would be a DFMEA, which we are going to speak about again, and there would be a design review one. And these are typical examples. These are standard formats which you as your organization need to create for yourselves and define in your design procedure. So how would we initiate a project? This is how we would do it. This is the form we would use. These are the people who would sign off. How would we define our design development plan? So you could define it in an Excel. This is fundamentally a work breakdown structure. It's fundamentally a big list of tasks and activities that have to be completed in a project mode. It could be done in a Microsoft project file. It could be done in an Excel file. But fundamentally, this is the breakdown of all the activities that would have to take place to achieve design completion and product release from the project initiation stage. Also initiated during the definition phase, and you must have heard this term if you are associated with healthcare technology and devices, is the design history file. And the design history file is the first file that an auditor or a regulator would ask to see. And the design history file is, so what is a design history file? So design history file is a compendium, a collation, or a compilation of every single document that is created during the design process, from initial ideation to commercial release of product. Whatever happens, so records and references, these records and references must provide evidence that the development and release of the device happened in accordance with the design control procedure. That's what, that is the expectation. So what typically goes into a design history file? So starting from initiation, approvals, the design plan, all user meetings, all design team meetings, all minutes, all version, all design computations, calculations, verifications, fluid analysis, finite element analysis, all design outputs, drawings, specifications, review meetings, meeting minutes, test plans, test protocols, actual tests, test reports, all versions. Remember, version 1, version 2, if tests are repeated, if something failed, then failed reports, analysis reports, and all of this, everything that happens during the process is what goes into a design history file. And it is not surprising sometimes to have as many as 20, 30, 40 box files, which form a design history file for one project. Now I'm coming to the most important document, and I'm going to skip many of the slides from this point onwards because they are repetitive in the sense that it's more of the same. But the most important document which I'm going to speak about as a design control aid or a design control supporting document is what I like to call the trace matrix. So what is the trace matrix? So I hope this text is clear to you. What the trace matrix fundamentally provides traceability of design output, design verification, and design validation to the design input. So what you have, it's nothing but a simple Excel file. The first column is design input. Then you have a user need number or a risk management output number. So what does this mean? This is a numerical reference as to where this design input came from. If it came from a user need, then user need number 3 or user need number 5, whatever, that number comes here. If it came from a risk management output, then the risk management file, every line of risk that is defined has a number, and that number comes in. Now, after design input, you have the verification plan. How am I going to verify if my design output met this input? So that's the verification plan. That's the second column. The next column is validation plan. How would we validate for this design input? Then you have the design output column. What is my output in corresponding to this input? So is it a drawing? Is it an IFU? Is it a catalog? Is it a circuit diagram? Is it a specification? Is it a list of ingredients or whatever? What is my output? Then what is my verification outcome? So the actual verification that was carried out according to the plan, what is the outcome? What is the document that refers to this outcome? What is the validation outcome? And what is the document that refers to this outcome? So as you can imagine, you can't really complete this document on day one. So that's why this is one of those documents which is called a living document. So this is a living document which is updated by the team as the project progresses. The day you complete writing your design input, you fill them in here. And then against your inputs, as you define your verification methods, you fill them in here. You define your validation methods, you fill them in here. You update your risk management. Any outputs coming from there, you update the inputs here. As you complete your design output work, you update this here. Okay, so that's how this becomes a living document. And this document becomes a kind of a go-to Bible for anybody who is working on the project, who can understand literally at a glance. Of course, it's not one glance because it becomes a pretty large file, but at one glance, you can see everything that's happening with this device, from user needs to inputs, to outputs, to verification, to validation. So I'm going to skip a number of these details because the rest of this presentation now is speaking about the actual procedure, design procedure contents throughout the remaining phases, the develop phase, and the validate phase. And we'll jump straight to something that happens post-design. What is a healthcare or a technology or a medical device organization expected to do? We are expected to have a very rigorous engineering change control procedure. So you can't just change anything. You can't change a design. You can't change a method of manufacturing. You cannot change a supplier. You cannot change an ingredient. You cannot change a dimension on a drawing. You cannot change a tolerance. So why is that? So anything that you change has the unfortunate effect of going and affecting something else. And so having a change control system is essential protection from what is called the law of unintended consequences, or Murphy's law. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong, right? So it is very important to define an engineering change control procedure once a design is released to market, where every single stakeholder, department, or function, design, quality, regulatory, manufacturing, supplier, who all the people, all the stakeholders who are contributing to the realization of that product or the manufacturing of that product have to study and opine that if this is changed, what else will be affected. So without having that process very clearly defined, one is not allowed to change anything. Last couple of slides before we move to questions. Why is design control so important in medical device and healthcare? So out of the various subsystems of an organization which are focused in quality audits, design control is one of the 4 subsystems which have the highest focus. Any auditor who comes and visits you is first going to look at your design control. What would they typically look at? Do you have a procedure? Do you have a plan? Have you documented design outputs? Is design verification done? Is validation completed? Have you taken into account usability and human factors? If software is involved, has software validation been done? What about risk analysis? Show me your risk analysis. How do you do design reviews and design transfer to manufacturing? What is your plan and what is your actual practice? So this is what typically auditors would look at. Design control, of course, does not end with commercial launch, because any change to any of the documents that are created during the design phase need to be constantly reviewed. And at any period between 1 year to 3 years, many of these documents need to be reviewed. Now, the big question is, how do we manage all of this as a startup? We are 2 people, and do we actually work on taking our proof of concept to prototype with the limited amount of funds and resources that we have, or do we sit and make all these documents? So that's a very valid question. So what is definitely possible to do for small startup organizations is what I call a staged approach. Now, in this staged approach, I define certain absolute must-dos. So why are these must-dos? These are must-dos for 2 reasons. Reason number 1 is there is only a particular point of time in the process when you can actually do these things. And recreating these documents later on is highly wasteful, unproductive, and income. And secondly, doing these actions early on in the process really saves you from risk and minimizes your risk of missing things in the design process. So the typical phases that we follow from a startup perspective is ideation, proof of concept, prototype, validation, commercialization. And what one can do is, here are the must-dos. At ideation stage, make sure that you are actually engaging with actual clinical users. It's not restricting yourself to just the ideation team, but making sure you engage with actual users and writing down, minuting, and documenting all the inputs that you get from users. Now, in the ideation and proof of concept stage, make sure you write down your user needs. So, those of you, I know there are 8 or 10 founder startup companies here. If you haven't written user needs so far, please make sure you start writing out your user needs and start maintaining the trace matrix document. Put down your user needs into the trace matrix, write those user needs into design inputs, define how you will verify the inputs, define how you will validate each of the inputs. Now, this is the bare minimum must do, which you make sure you follow and keep updating the trace matrix till you complete, as you complete your prototyping stage and as you do your validation. You don't have to do anything else. Because if you have this one Bible in place, you will be able to recreate everything else using this one document, the trace matrix. It is possible to eventually, as you reach close to completing your validation activities, you can actually start writing a design procedure, because by then you've actually done most of the work, so you know what you did, and it's a lot easier to sit and write a procedure at that point. So if you do these must-dos, then achieving design readiness for regulatory audit is going to be a lot easier, rather than scrambling at the end to just complete documents and complete paper because a regulatory consultant is telling you to do so. So I exceeded by about 5 or 6 minutes, and Vikrant, sorry for that.
No, sir, that's fine.
But it is done. So that's it. I hope there was some semblance of understanding of priorities which I was able to get across to all of you, and I am happy to take questions. So Vikrant, back to you.
Yes, sir. So, sir, thank you so much for sharing that useful information. So now we have some questions that participants has asked us during the registrations, and obviously we will be taking some from the current audience also. So very first question is from one of our incubator startup, that is Shelios. So they say that we have built an anti-pollution helmet for bike riders, but now they are adopting their technology for the healthcare applications and are making a powered air purification respirator. So they would like to know about certification requirements before they can sell a powered air purification in India or abroad.
Right. So if you're talking of an air purification device, it's firstly, I presume this is going to be a over-the-counter commercially sold product. That would be the intention. It doesn't sound like a medical device. If you're going to persist with the helmet application, so helmet with air purification, then there are Indian standards which a helmet has to maintain, has to comply to. If there is no helmet, if you're only talking about air purification, then this is not a medical device. So you don't really have medical device standards. You do not come under Drugs and Cosmetics Act as far as India is concerned. So you don't come within this space. You need to find out whether you come under a different space, which I am not qualified to opine on. But as an air purification device, this is not a healthcare product. It is not a medical device, and you would not have any compliances to do from a medical device perspective.
Okay, sir. So I think, sir, that was a very clear understanding of for the field of those air purification devices. So now we move to the next question.
Mhm.
So he says that today we see that hospital in rural areas cannot afford expensive medical equipment, which results in losses that cannot be expressed in words. So, what are the crucial strategies that can be adopted to minimize the cost of medical equipments that are used in primary healthcare centers?
So the first thing is, the healthcare system overall is designed from a primary, secondary, tertiary aspect. And a primary healthcare center is essentially meant to cater to the most basic healthcare needs for a large segment of population. And then you have secondary centers, which are more sophisticated. And then you have tertiary care, which is the highest level of sophistication. So, for example, a cancer hospital, a dedicated specialized cancer hospital. So, it is not typical in the healthcare system to put sophisticated and expensive equipment at a primary level. Rather, the primary healthcare center level has to be a screening center. That's the strategy. That is how it's usually designed. And it is not typical to have expensive equipment at the primary healthcare level, or for two reasons. One reason is underutilization, and typically the need for expensive equipment is never an emergency. So the primary healthcare center would screen patient for the need for a secondary or a tertiary level care, and that patient would then typically be referred to a specialist center. Remember, it's not just about expensive equipment; it's also about knowledge and skills. Okay, so knowledge and skills become scarce as you go higher up the ladder in terms of higher knowledge, higher skills, and higher sophistication. So you don't really have unlimited resources on these areas that you can percolate to all PHCs. The PHCs, by definition, would be basic primary level with the option of referring patients to better and more sophisticated centers based on need.
So now we move to the next question. So next is someone asked that how do we interface or program the different components of the device and what softwares are being used for doing so?
So different components of a device, I presume the question refers to an assembly of some kind, right? So if if it is a structural assembly or a mechanical structural assembly, then you're fundamentally going to be using some kind of CAD software. That is the typical way of doing it. You basically complete the assembly and do all the detailing of the components. The whole thing can be very easily achieved and accomplished in CAD.
So it means there are no any other specialized software for these. So rather,
Oh, there are a lot of very specialized software. So you have product lifecycle management software. I mean, the beauty about software is if you have money to spend, there is no end to what you can spend. So it's possible to have product lifecycle management software which will enable to keep control of every single component. It will enable you to sort of have your bill of material defined at ingredient level, at component level. It can have versions defined. It has access control, user level access. So this would be typically product lifecycle management or PLM.
So the next question is, what is the future of nanomaterials in the field of medical devices?
Nanomaterials has application in practically every field. Medical device is not exempt. Till date, there are no successful applications. However, the potential for using nanomaterials for targeting, very, very specific targeting of specific therapeutic areas with very high specificity, the potential exists. But till date, we do not see anything that has anybody who has successfully taken any clinical or therapeutic area and come up with a successful clinical application.
So, sir, there's one last question. So he says that are 3D spatial visualization skills a big asset in design?
Well, answer yes.
So, would you like to add
3D,
something to this?
3D visualization is any kind of okay. So if you say design, we are if we think linear, okay, most design involves a product, and if there is a product, then a product fundamentally is a physical structure or a physical manifestation of thoughts and ideas. And physical manifestation of thoughts and ideas fundamentally would be in a 3D structural form. And having the ability to visualize that is always going to be a useful asset.